This section is going to look specifically at the primary organs of digestion. And to clarify, these are the mouth, the esophagus, the stomach, the small intestine, and finally the large intestine. First and foremost, food is going to enter the mouth. There's going to be a lot of physical or mechanical digestion that's occurring with chewing, and then chemically we're going to have a little bit of breakdown. A small amount of carbohydrates are digested chemically in the mouth, and same with fats. So a little bit of carbs, a little bit of fats, not really any protein that's broken down from a chemical standpoint. The esophagus is very basic. Food is going to move from the mouth into the stomach via the esophagus. It's just a means of passage. After food makes its way through the esophagus and gets into the stomach, there is something that's known as the lower esophageal sphincter, kind of the door between the esophagus and the stomach, that's going to close shut. Now, sometimes this sphincter can be a little bit loose, and so what happens is, if it's loose, acidic contents in the stomach, because the stomach is very, very acidic, it can hop back in to our esophagus, and that's going to cause a little bit of burning, and it's going to cause a lot of pain. The acidic contents from the stomach going back into the esophagus, that is what causes the sensation of heartburn. And what's really interesting, and maybe even a little bit scary about this, is that if we have heartburn that occurs chronically or over a long period of time, this can develop into a condition where there's actual damage that's done to the lining of the esophagus, and this condition is known as gastroesophageal reflux disease, or GERD. Food is a bolus when it goes into our mouth and then it passes through our esophagus into our stomach. The acidic contents of the stomach is going to turn that bolus into something that is known as chyme. And chyme is what leaves the stomach to enter into the small intestine. But we have a food bolus in the esophagus and then in the small intestine. By the time it reaches that point, this is going to be chyme. There will be a little bit of mechanical digestion that is occurring in the stomach, but you also are having some chemical breakdown that's going on as well. So pepsin helps to chemically digest protein. Gastric lipase is going to help break down fat. And then we also have hydrochloric acid, which makes the stomach very acidic, and it makes the chyme that enters the small intestine very acidic. This also helps with the breakdown of foods in our stomach. Because our stomach is very acidic, the environment of our stomach is very harsh. So the pH, or the acidity of stomach acid, if you were to compare it to something that we're all very familiar with, if you compare it to lemons, the pH of stomach acid is 10 times that of a lemon. So it's very, very, very acidic. Now, if this were to go into our small intestine, as is, think about what happens in our esophagus. We have some very serious burning that's going to occur. If this reaches our small intestine without any changes that go on, it's going to damage the top of our small intestine. It's going to burn that up. Fortunately, when the chyme enters the small intestine, bicarbonate is released to that area, and bicarbonate is very basic, the opposite of acidic, and so that's going to cause the chyme to be neutralized so that our small intestine can handle and process it. The small intestine is where things really get interesting. Most digestion is going to occur in the small intestine, and this is just from chemical digestion. And then also most of the absorption is going to occur here. About 90% of all absorption that we experience occurs in the small intestine. So what happens is we have bile that breaks down fat, and then we also have digestive enzymes that are going to break down carbohydrates, fats, proteins into their very basic units. That's going to be released at the very top of the small intestine, and so as nutrients trickle further down, they can actually be absorbed. Now, the structure of the small intestine is very cool because it's designed to absorb a ton of things. First of all, the length of the small intestine is 5 feet long. But if you examine the inner walls of the small intestine, it's a little bit more complex than that. You have these things called villi, which are these finger-like projections that come up from all areas of the small intestine that are designed to collect and absorb nutrients. So that increases the surface area of the small intestine so that more nutrients can be absorbed. So you have those finger-like projections in the small intestine, and then out of those finger-like projections you have even a little bit more. You have something that's called microvilli, and those increase the surface area or the absorption ability of the small intestine a lot more. And so if you were to lay out the entire absorptive distance or length of your small intestine, you would get 250 square meters, which is about 60 meters taller than the Gateway Arch in St. Louis, pictured here on the left side of the screen. The large intestine is the final main organ of the GI tract. What happens here is peristalsis, that movement of the GI tract is going to slow down, and that slower movement favors growth of bacteria. Now, if we have bacteria, generally that's a bad thing, but in the case of the large intestine, healthy bacteria is very strongly correlated to health. And so eating probiotic-rich foods, which contain lots of these healthy bacteria, eating these foods, when they hit our large intestine, we're going to move them through very slowly, and that's going to promote growth of very healthy bacteria.
It is unfortunate that we are only going to dedicate a couple of slides in this class to the large intestine because there is so much potential for learning and future research that comes from the gut. Unfortunately, we do not know much, but we do know that there is a lot out there, and we will likely learn more, a lot more about the microbiome's functions relatively soon. But let's start off with what we do know. 1, there is a lot of bacteria in our gut. In fact, just in our gut, there is 10 times the amount of bacteria as there are human cells in the entire human body. 2, what we eat affects our health, and it affects our microbiome. Like we discussed in the last slide, probiotics provide healthy bacteria for the gut that allow it to perform functions related to health that we will discuss below. Also, prebiotics, which we can get simply from fiber, that provides food for the bacteria that's already residing in our intestines. So, both probiotics and prebiotics contribute to a healthy gut microbiome. 3, a healthy microbiome is linked to other positive health outcomes outside of our gut. The bacteria in our gut helps to break down some macronutrients. First of all, the carbohydrates, fats, and the proteins. There's also a link with disease prevention. There are products of gut metabolism that are linked to hormonal responses in other parts of our body that are linked to disease development progression, as well as prevention, delay, and management of disease. There are also interactions that occur between the bacteria and our brains. Unfortunately, we have a limited understanding of the link between gut health and both brain function, and disease. However, like we said before, expect research to delve into this topic in much greater detail and provide us with some more satisfactory answers in the years to come.
This final section is going to just briefly highlight the liver, and we'll do that on this slide. And then from there, it's going to go into the different energy systems. So the liver is going to decide what it is that we do with the final breakdown product of all the nutrients once they're digested and then absorbed. But then the energy systems, we'll talk about what we do with actual energy producing nutrients, these being carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Protein, carbohydrates, and fats. These are going to be the things that are broken down into actual energy. Now, it's not necessarily straightforward because the way that these are broken down for energy, it's going to differ between each of these nutrients. For protein, that's going to create larger muscles, which can store ATP. Protein rarely is going to actually be used itself for energy. It's more of an indirect source of energy, but it can hold, our muscle protein can hold lots of ATP, so it has a very large storage capacity of energy. And we're going to use this for very high intensity, explosive forms of exercise, very power-based forms of exercise, things that can last for about a very short amount of time. Carbohydrates are broken down to fuel higher intensity, but higher intensity that can be sustained a little bit longer. And then fats are going to fuel more aerobic, slower moving exercise, that type of activity. This will provide a little bit more of a visual with the stored protein, the stored ATP in protein. We're going to fuel very high power, high intensity, explosive exercise. Carbohydrates, it's going to fuel more sustained activity at a higher intensity, activity that we can sustain for about 90 seconds to 2 minutes. And then fats, that's going to sustain very moderate, mellow levels of intensity for physical activity. Large amounts of body protein is great because it can store a lot of protein. However, protein is often not used for energy. If we do use protein for energy, it means that we do not have enough carbohydrates and not enough fat. And both of those are a little bit more efficient and effective at fueling physical activity. So the reason that protein is a little bit more inefficient is that to use it for energy, it's going to require the breakdown of muscle tissue. It's going to require more energy to process, and it creates a toxic byproduct that's known as ammonia, which can cause kidney damage.